The Texas sun beat down on the small town of Pineview, a place where everyone knew everyone else. It was the kind of town where neighbors would wave as they passed each other on the dusty streets, and kids played in the yard without a care in the world. Life moved slowly here, and the people liked it that way. But one summer afternoon, the serenity of this town would be shattered, and the peaceful facade would hide a horrific secret. Pastor Daniel Greer had always been seen as a pillar of the community. He had led the Pineview Community Church for over a decade, his sermons touching the hearts of the faithful. He was a man of God, a man who could inspire his congregation to be better, to live better. His wife Evelyn was just as beloved, known for her gentle nature and unwavering support for her husband. Together they made an image of perfection, a power couple of faith. But when Evelyn disappeared one Thursday evening, the town was thrown into a frenzy. At first, no one thought much of it. Evelyn had always been the type to take long walks around their property, clear her mind, and reflect on her prayers. She'd done it countless times before, and no one had ever thought anything of it. But this time, something was different. She didn't return. Daniel initially played the worried husband. He called the police, organized search parties, and did everything he could to convince the town that he was devastated. He even spoke tearfully to the congregation the following Sunday, asking for prayers and appealing to anyone who might know of his wife's whereabouts. His grief seemed real, genuine. But as the days stretched into weeks with no sign of Evelyn, the town began to feel uneasy. The sheriff's office, led by seasoned investigator, Detective Sarah Lawson, had already started looking into the case. She had seen her fair share of missing persons reports. But there was something unsettling about the Greer case. Daniel was cooperative, but something in his eyes, the way he looked over his shoulder, the nervous tremble in his voice, felt off. "I don't know what happened to her," Daniel said in one of his many interviews with the police. "She was just gone. I woke up one morning and she was missing. I don't know if she ran off or if something happened to her. I just want my wife back." His words were convincing. But Detective Lawson had learned over the years that those who were too perfect were often the ones hiding the darkest secrets. As the days passed, there was no progress in the case. No ransom note, no suspicious characters, no sign of forced entry into their home. It was as though Evelyn had simply vanished into thin air. But Lawson wasn't one to give up. Something told her that this case was different, that the answers were hidden somewhere in Pineview, in the most unexpected places. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Lawson received a tip. An anonymous caller had informed the police about a strange sighting in the woods near the Greer's property. A local teenager had claimed to see Daniel Greer leaving the woods late one night, carrying something heavy. The teen didn't know what it was, but they said it was wrapped in plastic. The detective wasn't sure what to make of the tip, but she decided it was worth checking out. The next morning, she gathered a small team and headed out to the woods. They combed the area for hours, looking for any trace of Evelyn or something that might lead them to her. Then, just as they were about to give up, Lawson noticed something strange. A small clearing, partially covered by overgrown brush. As they approached, the scent hit them first, a pungent metallic odor that made Lawson's stomach turn. It was the unmistakable smell of decay. "Everyone, be on alert," Lawson ordered, her voice low and steady. They continued into the clearing, and that's when they saw it, an old rusty grill. It looked out of place, as if it had been there for years. But there was something about it that didn't sit right. The grill was slightly open, and it was covered in dark, charred remains. At first, they couldn't identify what it was, but Lawson's gut told her it wasn't just some discarded trash. It was something more, something sinister. As they took a closer look, Lawson noticed something horrifying. Burnt flesh-like remains still sizzling on the grill. The pieces were small, almost unrecognizable. It wasn't until one of the officers found a bone that the realization hit them. They weren't just looking at charred meat, they were looking at human remains. "Jesus Christ," one of the officers muttered, backing away. Lawson stood frozen, her mind racing. She had seen some terrible things in her career, but this was different. This was personal. This was calculated. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide their crime, and the fact that the remains were being cooked like food sent a cold shiver down her spine. They immediately called for backup, securing the area while they waited for forensic teams to arrive. As the pieces of the puzzle slowly started to come together, one thing was clear. Evelyn Greer had not simply disappeared, she had been murdered, and her body had been desecrated in the most grotesque way imaginable. The chapter ends here with a chilling discovery that will set the stage for Detective Lawson's investigation into the darkest corners of the Greer family's secrets. Would she be able to uncover the truth before more lives were destroyed? Would she be able to bring justice to Evelyn Greer, whose tragic fate had been hidden for so long? Only time would tell. The town of Pineview had always been a place where people lived simple lives, held deep values, and trusted each other. But as Detective Sarah Lawson stood in the clearing, staring at the charred remains on the grill, the town's innocent veneer cracked wide open. This wasn't just a missing persons case. This was murder, and the victim was none other than Evelyn Greer, the beloved wife of Pastor Daniel Greer, the very man who had prayed for her safe return. Lawson felt a weight settle on her chest. She had encountered many grisly scenes in her career, but there was something deeply unsettling about this one. The gruesome discovery wasn't just about the remains. It was about the man who had led them all in prayer, who had spoken of God's love and salvation, now standing at the center of a dark, twisted crime. The forensic team arrived shortly after, and Lawson watched as they carefully documented the scene, photographing the grill and the surrounding area. The smell of burnt flesh still lingered in the air, making her stomach churn with every breath. She moved back, giving them space to work, but her mind was already racing, connecting dots that hadn't yet formed into a clear picture. The first thing that came to mind was the tip. The anonymous caller had said they saw Daniel leaving the woods late at night, carrying something heavy. Lawson's gut told her that the missing woman, Evelyn, had been taken there, alive, before being brutally killed and discarded like an animal. The thought made her sick to her core, but she needed evidence, not assumptions. And, for that, she needed to speak to the man at the heart of this crime, Pastor Daniel Greer. Later that afternoon, Lawson walked into the small, humble office of the Pineview Police Department. She had called Daniel Greer in for questioning. Despite the mounting evidence, he still clung to the idea that his wife had simply vanished, that she had left him of her own accord. His stories were starting to wear thin. When Daniel walked into the interrogation room, Lawson noted his posture. Rigid, eyes darting around nervously as he sat down. He was still wearing the same suit he had worn to church that Sunday, but his once polished appearance now seemed a little too composed for a man who had just lost his wife. "Pastor Greer," Lawson began, her tone measured but firm, "we found your wife, or at least what's left of her." Daniel's face went pale and he quickly wiped his brow with a handkerchief. He swallowed hard, the first sign of fear creeping into his eyes. I don't understand," he stammered. "I don't know what you mean. What did you find?" "We found human remains, Pastor. Burnt, dismembered, and cooked." Lawson didn't hold back. She needed him to feel the weight of what he was involved in. Daniel's face contorted in confusion, but his eyes flickered for a brief second, just a flash, before he lowered his gaze to the table in front of him. His voice was shaky, but he quickly regained control. I don't know anything about that. I told you already, I woke up and she was gone. She left me. I don't know why. Maybe she just needed to get away. People do that sometimes." Lawson's eyes narrowed. "Do you really expect me to believe that, Pastor Greer? You're telling me that your wife left without a trace, without a word, and now you're telling me you have no idea why?" Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the table. His chest heaved with each breath, and Lawson could see that the pressure was starting to take its toll. He was unraveling, but she needed more. She needed a confession or some hint, some crack in his armor that would lead her to the truth. "I don't know what happened," Daniel said again, his voice weaker this time. "I loved Evelyn. She was my wife. I don't know where she is, but I swear I didn't hurt her." Lawson studied him, looking for any sign of guilt. There was something about his reactions, his reluctance, the way his eyes shifted when certain topics were raised, that didn't add up. She needed to dig deeper. But for now, she had one more card to play. "Pastor, we've found evidence that connects you to the remains. We know you were in the woods. We know you took something out there with you late at night, Lawson pressed, her voice calm but assertive. The grill, the meat, it's all tied to you. Daniel's face twisted in anger. That's ridiculous. I don't know what you're talking about. What do you want from me? Lawson leaned forward, locking eyes with him. I want the truth. If you tell me what happened to your wife, you might still have a chance to make this right. If you keep lying, Pastor, things are only going to get worse for you. For a moment there was silence. Daniel's hands were shaking now, his facade cracking. The room felt charged, thick with tension. Lawson could see him processing the reality of his situation. He was cornered, and he knew it. But then, unexpectedly, he looked up, his expression changing. You won't understand, he said softly, almost as though he was talking to himself. I never wanted any of this. I never wanted her to find out. Lawson raised an eyebrow. Find out what? Daniel let out a shaky breath. His shoulders slumped in defeat, and he spoke in a low, almost haunted voice. I've been living a lie, a secret. Evelyn found out. She saw things she wasn't supposed to, things I never meant for anyone to know. And when she threatened to leave me, I couldn't let that happen. For a moment, Lawson thought he was going to break down entirely. His voice faltered, and his eyes filled with what could only be described as a mix of guilt and desperation. Pastor, what did you do? Lawson pressed gently but firmly. I did what I had to, he whispered, his gaze hollow. She was going to expose me, and I couldn't let that happen. It was then that Lawson understood. The man before her wasn't just a pastor. He was something much darker, a man driven by his own twisted desires. But the question remained, what had Evelyn truly discovered? What dark secret had she stumbled upon that had led to her horrific end? With the confession hanging in the air, Lawson knew the case had taken a terrifying turn. But she was only scratching the surface. There was still so much more to uncover about Pastor Daniel Greer and the horrors lurking behind the walls of Pineview Community Church. And Lawson was determined to get to the truth, no matter where it led. The interrogation room felt suffocating as Pastor Daniel Greer sat in silence, his face a mixture of anguish and disbelief. His confession, though cryptic, had provided Detective Sarah Lawson with the first real breakthrough in the case. But it also left her with a chilling realization. There was more to this story than he had let on. Much more. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her eyes never leaving Daniel. She had been a detective long enough to know that when a suspect began to crack, they often started revealing bits and pieces of a much larger puzzle. But Daniel wasn't there yet. He was still hiding something. What exactly did Evelyn find out, Pastor? Sarah asked, her voice soft but insistent. Daniel's eyes flickered nervously, and for a brief moment, his hands trembled. He opened his mouth to speak, but then closed it, as if unsure whether to continue or retreat back into his previous denials. You don't understand, he finally whispered. You won't understand. She wasn't supposed to find out. No one was supposed to know. Then tell me, Sarah pressed, leaning forward slightly. Tell me what you did, and maybe we can help you. Daniel's face twisted in agony, but his lips finally parted. I didn't mean for it to get out of hand. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Sarah's gut twisted. He was talking in riddles, dodging the most important question, but she could see his internal struggle. He wanted to talk. He was slowly slipping into a state where the truth might finally come spilling out. What weren't you supposed to do, Pastor? Sarah asked again, her voice firm now. You said Evelyn saw something. What was it? Daniel sat still for a moment, his face drawn with shame. Then in a low, almost inaudible voice, he spoke. I'm a cannibal, he said, his words barely above a whisper. For a split second, Sarah couldn't process what he had just said. The room seemed to tilt, the weight of his confession hanging in the air like a thick fog. A cannibal. The word echoed in her mind, but she refused to let the shock overtake her. You're a what? Sarah managed to ask, her voice tight with disbelief. A cannibal, Daniel repeated, his voice barely audible. I've been eating people for years. I didn't want to. It started as something small, a desire. But then it grew and I couldn't stop. Sarah felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She had been a detective for years and had seen all manner of crime. Murders, thefts, corruption. But this was something she had never encountered. It was the stuff of nightmares. I didn't mean for Evelyn to find out, Daniel continued, his voice trembling. She saw something in the basement. She was snooping around one day when I wasn't home. She found the bodies, the remains of my victims. She didn't say anything at first, but I could see it in her eyes. She knew. She threatened to leave, to expose me to the world, and I couldn't let that happen. I didn't want to lose her. So I did what I had to do. Sarah's mind raced as she absorbed the gravity of his confession. This wasn't just a case of a missing person. This was something far darker. Pastor Daniel Greer had been hiding a horrific secret, one that had been buried beneath his role as a man of God. But now with Evelyn's death, the truth had come to light. "Tell me everything," Sarah said, her voice calm despite the turmoil inside her. How many people did you kill?" Daniel looked away, unable to meet her gaze. His eyes were filled with something between shame and fear. But it wasn't just fear of the law. It was fear of what he had become. "I've lost count," he whispered. "At least a dozen, maybe more. I didn't plan it at first. It started with animals. Then it was just people. Homeless people. Drifters. Anyone who wouldn't be missed." Sarah's stomach turned as she processed his words. The man she had once seen as a spiritual leader, a person who had gained the trust and admiration of an entire community, had been living a double life, one steeped in unspeakable horrors. And it wasn't just about the murders. It was about what he had done with the bodies, what he had done with the victims after he had taken their lives. I used to preach about love and forgiveness," Daniel continued, his voice hollow. "But I couldn't forgive myself. I couldn't stop. It was like an addiction, and when Evelyn found out, I thought I could stop. I tried. I swore I would. But when she threatened to leave, I couldn't bear the thought of losing everything. She was everything to me. She couldn't understand. No one could." The weight of his words pressed down on Sarah, but she knew she had to push forward. The confession was chilling, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. "How did you kill her?" Sarah asked, her voice steady. "How did it happen, Pastor?" Daniel's face contorted, as if he were reliving the horrific moment. His eyes filled with a mixture of regret and something else. Something darker, more primal. "I didn't mean to kill her," he said softly. "She was just supposed to be, I don't know. She was going to expose me. I panicked. I hit her. She fell. She hit her head on the table, and I didn't know what to do. She was unconscious, and I couldn't stop myself. I finished it." His voice broke as the weight of his actions hit him, but it was too late. Sarah already had the pieces she needed: the confession, the admissions of guilt, the details of how Evelyn had discovered his monstrous secret. It was all coming together. "Then what?" Sarah asked, her voice quiet but forceful. "What did you do with her body?" Daniel looked up at her, his eyes wide as if he were ashamed to speak the words aloud. I couldn't let her go to the police. I couldn't let anyone know. So I dismembered her. I cooked her. I didn't want to, but it was the only way. I didn't want to lose everything. I thought maybe I could feed her to the congregation. They would never know. They trust me. They love me." A shudder ran through Sarah as she processed the horror of what he had just said. This was beyond evil. This was a man who had betrayed everything he had ever preached, who had murdered his wife in cold blood, and then used her remains as a twisted offering to his followers. "Pastor," Sarah said, her voice low with disgust, "you've taken something precious from this world, and you'll never be forgiven for what you've done." The confession was a critical turning point in the investigation, but as Sarah Lawson stood up from the table and walked out of the room, she knew that this case was far from over. The town of Pineview had been shattered by the truth, and there were more questions to be answered. The full scope of Daniel Greer's depravity still remained hidden, and Detective Lawson was determined to uncover every last piece of the puzzle. The hunt for the truth had only just begun, and the road ahead would be darker than anyone in Pineview could have ever imagined. Detective Sarah Lawson walked back to her car, her mind still racing from the horrifying details Pastor Daniel Greer had just confessed to. The shock was wearing off, replaced by a cold, professional resolve. She had heard confessions before, but nothing had prepared her for the evil that had seeped out of the walls of Pineview Community Church. The confession about Evelyn's murder was chilling, but it wasn't the end of the story. There were still unanswered questions. Why had he done it? What led to his descent into madness? And how many others had he killed? Her first task now was to get the rest of the evidence in order. The forensic team was still working through the remains in the woods, but they had already uncovered a disturbing amount of physical evidence. From the meat that had been grilled to the traces of blood in the pastor's home, it was clear that this wasn't just the death of one woman. There had been a pattern, a horrifying series of events that had likely spanned years. Back at the police station, Sarah gathered her team and briefed them on the new developments. The room was quiet, the usual bustle of activity replaced by a somber atmosphere. Even seasoned detectives were taken aback by the magnitude of the crime. Sarah wasn't sure if they were more shocked by the brutality of Pastor Greer's actions or by the fact that it had all been happening under their noses, within the very heart of their community. "We've got to dig deeper," Sarah said, pacing in front of the whiteboard where photos of Pastor Greer, Evelyn, and the crime scene were pinned. "We know what happened to Evelyn, but we need to find out how many others there are. This man is a serial killer, and he's been hiding in plain sight." Detective Mark Reynolds, a seasoned investigator who had been with the department for nearly 20 years, raised his hand. "We need to look at Greer's history. Who's been missing in the area over the years? Who's been under the radar? I'm willing to bet there are more bodies to uncover." Sarah nodded. "Exactly. Let's pull up missing persons reports from the past few years, and we'll start cross-referencing them with Greer's known contacts. We need to find out if any of his former parishioners or acquaintances have disappeared without explanation." Over the next few hours, Sarah and her team worked tirelessly, sifting through case files and piecing together the timeline of Pastor Greer's activities. They uncovered unsettling patterns, several individuals who had gone missing without a trace, many of them drifters, homeless, or people who had no family to speak of. But there were also a few familiar names, people from the church. One name in particular stood out: Angela Davis. Angela had been a regular at the church for over a decade. She was well liked by the congregation, a quiet woman who had often volunteered at the food pantry and church events. She had disappeared 2 years ago, without a single lead as to her whereabouts. At the time, there had been no foul play suspected. She was just another person who had vanished. But now, looking back, her disappearance seemed more sinister. "Get me everything we have on Angela Davis," Sarah instructed Mark. "Look into her relationship with Greer. I want to know what kind of person she was. Talk to anyone who might have seen her in the weeks before she disappeared." The next day, Sarah and her team sat around the table, reviewing their findings. Angela Davis's disappearance had been more than just a random case. Sarah had spoken to a few members of the congregation who had remembered her well. They recalled that Angela had seemed withdrawn in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Several people said that she had been seen talking to Pastor Greer on more than one occasion in private, though she had never explained what the conversations were about. It was as if she had known something that had made her nervous, even frightened. But no one had thought to question it. After all, Pastor Greer was a man of God. Who would suspect him of anything nefarious? But now, with this new information, the pieces began to fall into place. Angela Davis had likely been one of his earlier victims, and Evelyn, her own wife, had stumbled upon the same truth. Later that day, Sarah and Mark drove out to the site where Greer had disposed of Evelyn's remains. The forensic team had been thorough in their investigation, and they had found several disturbing items that confirmed the grisly nature of the crime. In addition to Evelyn's remains, they had found traces of what appeared to be other human remains, bones that had been burned beyond recognition. As Sarah stood in the clearing, looking at the area where the pastor had discarded his wife's body, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. There were more bodies out there, more victims. "This man is sick," Sarah muttered under her breath, her gaze locked on the charred remains. And he's been hiding it all these years. Mark stood beside her, his expression grim. The question now is how long this has been going on, and how many more people he's killed. They turned back to the car, but Sarah's mind was already racing ahead. They needed to search Greer's house, his private quarters, again. The confession had revealed that he had hidden his darkest secrets in plain sight. There had to be something more in that house. Documents, photographs, even more physical evidence that would connect the dots. Back at the Greer residence, Sarah and her team scoured every room. They went through his office, his study, and even the basement, where he had confessed to keeping his supplies in the past. It was there, in the cold, dark corner of the basement, that Sarah found what she had been searching for. In a locked chest, buried beneath a pile of old church records and dusty crates, Sarah found several items wrapped in cloth. When they unwrapped them, her stomach lurched at the sight of human bones. Bones that had been carefully stored, almost as if Greer had been keeping trophies of his victims. But there was something else. Photographs. Many of them were of Evelyn, but there were others too. Photos of women, some familiar, some unknown, captured in moments that could only be described as eerie. These women were all alive, but the way they were positioned in the photos, their eyes vacant, their bodies stiff. It was clear to Sarah that these were images of victims who had been carefully controlled, manipulated, and perhaps even tortured. God, Sarah whispered, holding up one of the photographs. He's been doing this for years. Mark, who had been looking over her shoulder, nodded grimly. This isn't just about cannibalism. This is about power, control. He was grooming them. The realization hit Sarah like a ton of bricks. Pastor Daniel Greer wasn't just a killer. He was a predator, and every step of his twisted journey had been meticulously planned. From the way he had preyed on vulnerable people in his congregation, to the way he had seduced them into trusting him before he turned them into victims. As Sarah sat in the basement, the weight of what she had uncovered pressing down on her, she knew there was only one thing left to do. She had to make sure that Daniel Greer would never hurt anyone again. But as she stood up to leave, a new thought began to form in her mind. What if there were more churches like Pineview? What if there were more predators hidden behind the mask of piety? She wasn't just dealing with a single case anymore. She was standing at the edge of something much larger, a network of darkness and deception that had been thriving under the guise of faith. And it was her job to expose it. No matter where it led, the fight was far from over. The investigation into Pastor Daniel Greer had taken a darker turn, one that Sarah Lawson had not anticipated when she first set foot in Pineview. What had started as a gruesome murder case had evolved into something far more sinister, an underground world of deception, manipulation, and a predator hiding behind the cloak of spirituality. Pastor Greer wasn't just a murderer. He was the center of a twisted web that had been thriving for years. A web that was now beginning to unravel with each new discovery. After Sarah and her team found the photographs and human remains in Greer's basement, they knew they had to dig deeper. Every clue, every piece of evidence, pointed to a horrifying truth. Pastor Greer had been carefully crafting his criminal activities for years, and if they didn't act fast, more victims could still be out there, trapped in the pastor's grip. The first thing Sarah did after leaving the Greer residence was contact her superior, Lieutenant Mitchell. The investigation had grown beyond her control, and she needed all the resources she could get. If Greer was running a secret network, they needed to uncover it before it spiraled further out of control. I need full access to Greer's financial records, Sarah instructed Mitchell over the phone. We need to see who's been supporting his church, who's been giving him money, and if there's any connection between his financial backers and these disappearances. Mitchell, who had been with the department for nearly as long as Sarah, didn't hesitate. I'll get the finance team on it right away. I'll also have the local banks flagged for any suspicious transactions. It sounds like we're dealing with more than just a serial killer here. Sarah was already heading back to the station, where she would spend the rest of the afternoon coordinating with the FBI, who had been brought in to assist. They were beginning to see the scope of the case, not just a local pastor who had gone rogue, but a predator who had potentially been preying on vulnerable people for years, using his position of power to hide his dark desires. By the next morning, Sarah had a clearer picture of Greer's financial situation. After sifting through his bank records and ministry donations, a disturbing trend began to emerge. Over the last few years, Pastor Greer had been receiving large anonymous deposits into his personal and church accounts. Some of the deposits were small, just a few $100s here and there, but others were far more significant, reaching thousands of dollars. But it wasn't just the large amounts that stood out. What troubled Sarah most was the regularity of these deposits. They came at odd times, on the same days of the week, sometimes as often as twice a week, and there was no clear explanation for the source of the funds. She quickly requested a deeper investigation into these deposits, particularly the large anonymous ones. Were they donations, and if so, who was behind them? Later that day, the FBI team had made a breakthrough. They had traced the anonymous deposits to an offshore account linked to a series of shell companies, companies with no clear owners or business addresses. However, they did uncover one startling connection. The names of several high-profile individuals from both the local and national levels had been associated with these accounts. "Hold on, Agent Mason," one of the FBI agents said, pointing to his screen. "We've got something here. There's a connection between Greer and a group of powerful businessmen from Texas. They've been funneling money into his church for years, but it doesn't stop there. The same group is involved in shady business ventures, real estate, agriculture, and even some illegal activities." Sarah leaned over the desk, her pulse quickening. "What kind of illegal activities?" Mason scrolled through the files. "Drugs, human trafficking. It's like a whole underground network of criminal activity, and it's all linked back to Greer." The realization hit Sarah like a tidal wave. Pastor Greer wasn't just a lone wolf. He was part of a much larger criminal syndicate, a syndicate that was using the church as a front for illicit activities. And it seemed like Greer had been using his position as a pastor to recruit, manipulate, and control people to serve the needs of this hidden network. Sarah sat back in her chair, feeling a cold weight settle in her chest. The pastor's confession had only been the tip of the iceberg. What was supposed to be an investigation into a single murder had now expanded into something far larger and far more dangerous. She needed to confront Greer again. There were too many unanswered questions, too many loose ends that could lead to more victims. And this time, she was going to push him for every last detail. Later that evening, Sarah returned to the interrogation room where Pastor Greer sat, looking more disheveled than before. His once neatly combed hair was now tangled, and his suit, which had been impeccable the day before, now looked wrinkled and torn at the edges. He looked smaller, weaker, like a man who had finally realized the full scope of his actions and couldn't escape the consequences. Sarah sat across from him, her expression hard. "We've traced the money, Pastor," she said, her voice cold. "We know you've been receiving large sums from several people, businessmen with ties to criminal activity, human trafficking, drugs. These aren't just donations. You've been a part of something much bigger than you're willing to admit." Greer's eyes widened, and for the first time, Sarah saw genuine fear in them. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was trembling now, his hands shaking in his lap. "We know you didn't do this alone," Sarah continued, her voice low and deliberate. "You've been working with powerful people, people who have been using you and your church as a front for their own twisted agenda. You've been feeding them your victims, Pastor, and I don't think you did it out of some sick obsession alone. You were getting paid for it." Greer's face twisted in agony, and he finally spoke, his voice hoarse. I didn't mean for it to happen. I thought I was doing God's work. I thought I was helping these people. But they controlled me. They told me what to do. I had no choice." Sarah leaned forward. "You had a choice, Greer, and you chose to turn a blind eye to the horrors happening around you. You chose to let these people die, to feed them to your congregation, to cover up your sins with prayers and sermons. And now it's all coming back to haunt you." Greer broke down, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't know who else to turn to. They promised me wealth, power, a place in their world. and I couldn't resist. Sarah's jaw tightened. She had heard enough. It was clear that Greer had been part of something much larger, something far more organized than a single deranged individual. This was a network of people, operating under the guise of faith, who had been using their positions to exploit the most vulnerable in society. "We're going to bring it all down," Sarah said, her voice sharp. "Starting with you." The next few days were a blur of activity. Sarah and her team continued to uncover more information about Greer's ties to the criminal syndicate. They uncovered photos, financial transactions, and even videos that showed Greer meeting with other members of the group. The investigation had grown into a full-scale operation, with agents and officers working around the clock to gather evidence. But the more they uncovered, the more questions arose. How deep did this go? Who else was involved? And were there more victims they had yet to uncover? As Sarah sat in her office, reviewing the evidence, she realized that the investigation was far from over. Pastor Daniel Greer had been a predator hiding in plain sight, but now that the truth had come to light, it was clear that the fight was far from won. The web of deception was deep, and it was going to take everything Sarah had to bring the full extent of the operation to light. The next chapter in this dark tale had only just begun. The days that followed Pastor Daniel Greer's confession were an avalanche of revelations. What had initially been a case of one man's grotesque actions had grown into a complex criminal network, an operation that spanned not just the borders of Pineview, but the entire state of Texas, possibly even beyond. As Sarah Lawson sifted through mountains of paperwork, digital files, and testimonies, the picture painted before her became more terrifying and more expansive than she ever anticipated. Pastor Greer, once a pillar of the community, was merely a pawn. The real masterminds were far more insidious and well-connected than she could have imagined. But as Sarah knew all too well, the more tangled the web, the harder it was to untangle. Sarah sat at her desk in the station, staring at the pile of evidence in front of her. On top of the stack was a file labeled The Greer Network, a Syndicate of Faith. The FBI had handed over a preliminary report that morning, and the document sent a chill down her spine. It painted a picture of a vast criminal enterprise that had exploited the vulnerable under the guise of faith, wrapped in holy scripture and cloaked in power. A group of influential businessmen, many of whom were connected to large corporations, were using churches across the state as covers for their criminal operations. They were laundering money, trafficking in human beings, and using religious organizations to manipulate and control those who came to them for help. The Greer case was just one of many. Sarah ran her fingers through her hair, feeling the weight of the case pressing down on her chest. She could hardly breathe as she absorbed the scale of it all: the money laundering, the trafficking, the sick ritualistic murders. All of it had been hidden beneath the veil of the church. Greer's connection to these men wasn't just financial. There was something darker at play. The pastor had been an active participant in their schemes, taking part in their criminal activities with both eyes wide open. He wasn't coerced. He had chosen this path, thinking he could live a life of luxury by feeding the most vulnerable to the insatiable appetites of the elite. As she opened the file and began reviewing the documents, a name jumped out at her: Thomas Wardle, a wealthy Texas businessman with investments in real estate, oil, and agriculture. Wardell had been tied to multiple shell companies that funneled money through Greer's church. He was listed as one of the major financial backers. He also had ties to several other pastors across the state, men who, like Greer, were believed to have used their positions to further the criminal agenda of the syndicate. Sarah's stomach turned. This was bigger than a single corrupt pastor. It was a network of power brokers, all working together to manipulate people's faith for profit and control. They had preyed on the most vulnerable, those who had nowhere else to turn, and they had done it under the guise of charity, of giving, of salvation. Later that day, Sarah was called into a meeting with the lead FBI agent, Mason, and her team of detectives. They gathered around a large conference table with maps of Texas and photographs of various church locations spread out before them. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with the knowledge of just how deep this case had gone. "We've confirmed Wardell's involvement," Mason began, his voice grim. "We've traced his movements, and we know he met with Greer several times in the past year. We also have surveillance footage of him leaving Greer's church late at night on several occasions. This confirms that Greer was more than just a member of the syndicate. He was an active participant in their operations. Sarah's eyes narrowed as she looked at the photographs of Wardell and Greer standing together, shaking hands like old friends. The images were taken in plain view, but they had been too careful to leave any real evidence behind. If not for the breakthroughs in financial tracing and surveillance footage, this could have remained a mystery. We also have intel on other pastors in the network, Mason continued. There are at least 5 churches we've identified where similar operations are taking place. These pastors have been taking in large donations, much like Greer did. They have connections to powerful businessmen who use these donations to launder money and traffic people. We believe there are even more locations, but these are the ones we've confirmed. Sarah felt a lump in her throat. This wasn't just a small-time crime ring. This was organized, systemic, and entrenched in the very fabric of religious institutions. They had hidden their criminal activities beneath the sanctity of the church, gaining the trust of their congregants while simultaneously exploiting them. We need to move fast, Sarah said, her voice firm. We need to make arrests and shut down these operations. But we have to be careful. We're dealing with powerful people who won't hesitate to cover their tracks or destroy evidence. Mason nodded. Agreed. The FBI is working on warrants for the other pastors. We've already begun tracking their movements. But we need your team's help. If we can take down Wardell, we might be able to break open the rest of the syndicate. The following days were a blur of investigation, planning, and coordination. Sarah's team worked tirelessly to collect evidence, track down key players, and prepare for the inevitable raids on the churches. They were still gathering intel on the other pastors involved in the network, but the more they learned, the clearer it became that this was a far-reaching operation, one that had spanned years and involved dozens, if not hundreds, of people. Meanwhile, Sarah continued to probe deeper into Greer's past. She spoke to former parishioners who had left the church after Greer had become more erratic and controlling. Many had been reluctant to speak out at first, but after learning about the pastor's crimes, they were willing to share what they knew. Some recalled instances where Greer had preached bizarre, cryptic sermons about sacrifice, power, and control. Others spoke of how he had treated his congregation with a sense of superiority, always looking down on anyone who questioned him. It was as if Greer had been preparing them for something much darker, conditioning them for his eventual betrayal. He had used the pulpit to manipulate his followers, weaving a web of lies so thick that none of them saw what was coming until it was too late. Sarah sat in her office, exhausted but resolute. She knew they were close to dismantling the syndicate. They had already begun to make arrests, but there was still so much left to uncover. Greer had confessed, but she knew he was only telling them part of the story. The full extent of his involvement and the involvement of others would come to light only when the entire network was exposed. The clock was ticking. The deeper Sarah dug, the more dangerous this case became. Wardell, the other pastors, and the shadowy figures pulling the strings, they would all stop at nothing to protect their empire. But Sarah wasn't about to let them win. She would bring them down, no matter how long it took. That evening, as Sarah made her way home, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Mason. We've got Wardell in custody. We're moving on the other pastors tomorrow. The network is about to implode. A surge of relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. The real work was just beginning. Wardell might be behind bars, but Sarah knew the syndicate's reach was still vast. And if the past few weeks had taught her anything, it was that evil could hide anywhere, even behind the pulpit. The fight to expose the truth and to bring justice to those who had been exploited and abused was far from over, and Sarah Lawson was determined to see it through. The case had consumed every waking moment of Sarah Lawson's life for the past month, but she was close, so close, now that the pieces of the puzzle were almost in place. The arrest of Thomas Wardell, the wealthy businessman, was a pivotal moment. It was the first real crack in the syndicate that had been operating under the guise of faith. But while Wardell's capture was a significant win, Sarah knew there was still so much to uncover. The other pastors were still out there, continuing their twisted operations, hiding behind their pulpits and preaching a message of salvation while feeding their congregation to the very system that had enslaved them. And then there was Pastor Daniel Greer, the man who had started it all. the man whose confession had opened the door to this nightmare. He was behind bars, but Sarah knew that his knowledge was only a small part of the much larger, darker picture. It was early morning when Sarah received the call. Her phone buzzed on her desk, pulling her out of her thoughts as she pored over the latest financial records. It was Mason. "We've got movement," Mason said, his voice terse. "One of the other pastors is on the move. We just intercepted a call. He's trying to flee the country. We need you to come down here now." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The man Mason referred to was Pastor Martin Hale, one of the key figures in the network. Hale's church, which had once been one of the largest in Texas, had been at the center of the syndicate's operations. The FBI had already raided several of his properties and discovered disturbing evidence of trafficking and money laundering, but Hale had always managed to slip through their fingers. Until now. "On my way," Sarah replied, grabbing her jacket and heading for the door. Within an hour, Sarah arrived at the FBI's temporary command center. It was buzzing with activity. Agents were poring over satellite images, monitoring traffic in and around Hale's church. The man was still a powerful figure in the community, and his connections were extensive. His escape could signal the collapse of the entire investigation. If he managed to disappear again, the syndicate would remain intact. "Sarah," Mason greeted her, his face tight with urgency. "We've got a team in place, but we need to move fast. Hale's just left his compound, heading towards the airport." The urgency in his voice sent a shiver down her spine. This wasn't just a man on the run. This was a desperate criminal who would stop at nothing to protect himself and his operations. "Where's he now?" Sarah asked. "Near the outskirts of the city. He's not alone. He's got a car full of people with him," Mason replied, flipping through a stack of papers. "We believe they're loyalists from his church, people who are either involved in the operations or just too afraid to speak out." The chase was on. Sarah and Mason led the team of agents, racing through the streets trying to get ahead of Hale's convoy. They had already alerted the local authorities to close off any escape routes, but Hale's group was crafty, taking back roads to avoid detection. It felt like hours before they finally cornered Hale's vehicle in a remote part of the city, a quiet, residential neighborhood that seemed far removed from the criminal empire he had built. The agents surrounded the car, weapons drawn, ready to apprehend the man who had been running his operation from the pulpit for so long. "Get out of the vehicle!" Sarah shouted through a megaphone, her heart pounding in her chest. The car's doors opened slowly, and Pastor Hale stepped out, flanked by two men and a woman. He looked disheveled, his face gaunt, but the arrogance in his eyes hadn't changed. He was a man who thought he could escape his fate, a man who believed he could outrun justice. "We've got you, Hale," Sarah said, stepping forward with the FBI agents. "Your game is over." The pastor didn't resist, but his eyes gleamed with something far more dangerous than fear. He was a man who knew too much about the other players in the syndicate, too much about the operations, and too much about the vulnerable people he had destroyed. The arrest of Hale was the final piece to fall into place. With his capture, the FBI could finally connect the last dots of the criminal enterprise, bringing down a network that had been operating under the radar for years. Back at the command center, Sarah watched as agents processed Hale's belongings: wallet, phone, laptop, hoping to find more evidence. Hale remained silent, but Sarah knew that this was just the beginning. The man wasn't about to go down without a fight. He knew too much, and he was going to use every bit of information to his advantage. "You're not going anywhere," Mason said to Hale as the pastor sat in the interrogation room, a cold smile on his face. Sarah stood outside the room, watching through the one-way mirror as Mason began the questioning. Hale was silent for a long time, but then he finally spoke, his voice low and controlled. "I know why you're here," Hale said, looking directly at Mason. "You think you can stop it, but you can't. This is bigger than you, bigger than me. There are people who will make sure this all disappears. You'll never see them coming." Mason leaned forward. "What do you mean? Who else is involved? How far does this go?" Hale laughed, a cold, humorless sound that echoed through the room. "You think I'm the mastermind? You think I'm the only one pulling strings? There's so much more than you know. The money, the power, it doesn't stop here. It goes all the way to the top. And even if you take me down, you won't be able to stop them." That night, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Hale was hiding something. The confession he had made in the interrogation room felt like a warning, not a surrender. There was more to this story, more that he wasn't telling them. The next morning, after Hale had been transferred to a more secure facility, Sarah went through the evidence again, carefully combing through the files one more time. There was a pattern she hadn't seen before, connections between Hale and politicians, a web of influence that extended into the highest offices in the state. This wasn't just about a handful of corrupt pastors. It was a systemic, deeply entrenched network that had used the church as a front for money laundering, trafficking, and control. As the investigation wrapped up, Sarah knew that the arrest of Pastor Greer, the capture of Wardle, and Hale's fall had put a stop to the operations at the heart of the syndicate. But there were still more questions than answers. The network was far-reaching, its tendrils embedded in the fabric of Texas politics and business. They had barely scratched the surface. Sarah looked out of her office window, the weight of everything pressing on her shoulders. She had brought down the criminals who had hidden behind the mask of faith, but the fight wasn't over. The road ahead was uncertain. There were powerful people who had been exposed, but there were many others who still lurked in the shadows, pulling strings from behind the scenes. For Sarah, this case was more than just about solving a crime. It was about bringing light to a world that had been kept in darkness for far too long. And while the arrest of Greer, Wardle, and Hale was a victory, Sarah knew the battle wasn't over. She wasn't done yet. The investigation was just beginning.